All right, so we have our storage account that we've created, and hopefully we have been interacting with it, creating containers, uploading files. I should point out that accessing your storage account through the Azure portal is probably not the normal way that you're going to access it in a production setting. Storage accounts are really designed to be accessed programmatically. Now, you can go into the container and hit upload and do some manual administrative things if you need to, but I don't think it's the expectation that you're going to be accessing this contents through this portal. So if we go back to the storage account, if we go under keys, we'll see that Microsoft helpfully provides a connection string alongside with the security key so that we can use this in a .NET program or any kind of thing that accepts a connection string format in order to learn how to access this storage account. Now, if we do need to view the contents of a storage account besides going into the containers and navigating directly, there are a couple of applications you can use to access it. Now, one is called Storage Explorer, and the other is called Storage Browser. Now, Storage Explorer at this time is a downloadable piece of software that you can download to your local machine, install and run, and then you'll get programmatic access to this storage account as an app on your local machine. And so if you say open in Explorer, it's going to trigger the local program to run and connect to the storage account. If you're using the browser, then you would use Storage Browser. I'm going to minimize the menu here. As we can see, we can access the containers, file shares, queues, and tables using Storage Browser. So I can see that I can access the container that I created. I can set them as favorites. I can do all the manipulations here within a browser that I need to. There's a search box, etc. Okay, this isn't too difficult different than accessing the containers through the containers menu, but yeah, you can set favorites. You can filter based on things. If you had created index key when you created the container, you could do that, things like that. So Storage Browser is a way to access all of your storage, not just containers, but files, queues, and tables contents as well. So let's give ourselves a hypothetical scenario here. Let's say that you have a storage account that contains one or more containers, and there are hundreds of gigabytes of data in that storage account. And then you want to copy those files into another storage account, either in the same subscription as you or even in an unrelated different subscription. How do you copy data between blob containers? So one of the answers to that, of course, is that you could go to the storage account in question. You could download the data from the Azure service to your computer at home or at the office, and then go to that storage account and upload the data manually. Now, that's a terrible solution, obviously. Many reasons. One of them, of course, is that with lots and lots of data, you're going to have to download that. It could take many minutes or hours, depending on the amount of data. And the second thing, of course, is there is a data charge for bandwidth. And so it's going to cost you money if you have terabytes and multiple terabytes of data to get out of the Azure cloud onto your own computer. That would actually have a cost associated with it. So what we would want for best efficiency is to copy data between storage accounts inside of the Azure network without having to download those files outside of Azure in order to upload them. And so one of the answers to that is a command line tool called AZCopy. Now, AZCopy, you could actually download this onto your computer, and it comes in all the different operating systems. Or it would work within the Azure Cloud Shell as well. So you can do that within Cloud Shell. And what it does is it helps you to copy blobs and files to or from a storage account. You could even use this to download to your local machine or upload from your local machine into Azure. But it's also good for moving data between storage accounts. And it can do that inside of Azure without the data having to travel across the internet, download to your machine. Like, you avoid some of those downsides. So the short answer is AZ copy. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to access the data that I want to copy from. And so I'm in my AZ SJD Demo 1 account here, and I have a particular file that I want to copy. This is just for demo. It's not a very big file, but I do want to copy this. The way we're going to copy in this example is using an SAS token. We saw earlier in this course that you can give permissions, temporary permissions, to someone for a short period of time. So here's the signing key, read permissions, very short period of time, HTTPS only, and I'm going to say generate. And I'm going to copy the entire URL for now. And I'm going to paste this in my computer here in a little notepad so that I can access it later. The other thing we're going to need is, of course, the destination. If that's the source, I created another storage account, and I'm going to go into containers, and I created a second container, but this container is empty. So I'm going to create myself an SAS token for the second container, but in this case, I want to be able to write to that container. And in actual fact, I'll just give myself almost full permissions for that. Again, short period of time, HTTPS only, generate SAS, and I'm going to copy the URL into the notepad here. So I have the file, and I have the source and the destination. All right. So I'm going to close that up, and I'm going to go into a Cloud Shell. Again, I could download the program to my computer. That would be a good way to do that as well. And the other thing too is it's not the only way to do this, right? So there's AZ copy is fairly complex. You can give yourselves Active Directory permissions and authenticate yourself as well. All right, so let's bring up the Cloud Shell here. And we're going to just check real quick if AZ copy, let's just clear. AZ copy exists, and it does. You can see AZ copy -- help gives you more information, but it gives you the commands, right? Copy, list, login, log out, etc. So AZ copy, AZ copy, and the command is copy. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our notepad here, and I'm going to put a single apostrophe, and I'm going to paste in the source URL. And then we're going to go back to the notepad and get the destination. Again, single apostrophe here, paste the destination, and close that out. And so this is basically going to copy this specific file from the first container to the second container in a different storage account. This would also work across subscriptions because you are creating this SAS token, and that's the way that you're allowing permission. So I'm going to hit enter, and we can see here that 100% done, nothing failed, nothing was pending, took less than a fraction of a second, 3/100ths of a second. If I was to close this up, go into the second container, I can see the file now exists there. So the AZ copy is a tool that can be used in the Cloud Shell. You can download it and can be used to basically move files around either between cloud accounts or uploads, downloads, synchronizations. You can do this with Amazon S3 buckets or Google Cloud Storage buckets and things like that. Let's talk about another option for storing files in the cloud, which is Azure File Storage. So we've been talking about blobs and containers up till now, but there is also another type of storage in the cloud called file storage. Now, file storage is slightly different than container storage. This is a true hierarchical structure, the way that you would have on your local operating system disk. You can even mount this storage to a server or your desktop and refer to it using a drive letter if you're using Windows or any of those other mounting options for Linux and Mac. And it supports the SMB protocol, which is cross-platform Windows, Linux, and Mac, or NFS mounts for Linux only. So you know when you work in a corporate environment, sometimes you have a central storage file server that everyone has access to, or maybe you have your own directory or file folder within that drive where it's only you have access to it. It's both options, or project-based access. This is that in the cloud. Now, why? Why do we need Azure Files as opposed to container storage, which we've just been talking about? Well, this really is a analogy to the on-premises file server. This allows you to actually completely replace your on-premises file server with the cloud, or have additional storage in the cloud where your primary storage is on-prem. This is sometimes called lift and shift migration, when you don't have to make any changes between the way that you operate in your current architecture and the way that you operate in the cloud. If you don't have to make any changes, that's lift and shift migration, and having a file server is certainly part of that. You get additional benefits. So if you have a file server on-prem, you have to do your backups. If it starts to run out of space, you have to add physical hard disks into the network there. So the cloud Azure Files have the redundancy option, so it keeps multiple copies of your files locally. You can do data recovery, the failover we've talked about with the container storage also applies. Much easier to operate with Azure Files compared to the stuff you have to do on-prem. Now, there's also an option called Azure File Sync. Now, this allows you to operate in a hybrid fashion where you have some method of files on premises and additional files in the cloud. So you do have the option with Azure File Sync. This is called cloud tiering, where you have, let's say, your most popular files are stored locally and all files are stored in the cloud. So you might have 20 gigabytes locally and 20 terabytes in the cloud. And that way your files are locally available immediately, but not all of them because it's just too much data. It also allows you to have cloud access to your files around the world, so you can have files in one region and files in the other, and they're all synchronized, as well as just using the cloud as your backup location. So even if you want to continue using your file server locally, you can have file sync to keep a copy of those files in the cloud. When we're first thinking about moving to the cloud, one of our considerations is likely going to be how difficult it will be to move everything that you have on your local environment into the cloud. This includes includes applications, this includes databases, this includes your storage, your file servers, etc. It might be a ambitious undertaking to move all of that without having too much disruption. So Microsoft has a tool called Azure Migrate that they will examine your existing environment and make recommendations that'll make your life easier to move to the cloud. This is called a guided experience. So based on your own environment, what is the best case and the best practices in terms of moving? So if we go into the Azure Migrate tool, we will see there's a number of tools actually. There's a discovery tool, and so it's going to look at your physical and your existing virtualized servers in your data center or from other clouds, even AWS or others, and what you're going to need inside of Azure. It'll look into SQL Server. It'll look into IIS web apps and things like that. And so there's a number of tools that will help you with that. So you might not even have an up-to-date inventory of everything that you have. And so this is going to help you discover these things within your environment. Then you can put together a plan to see how you're going to migrate all of that into Azure. There's maybe servers that can just be lift and shift migrated into the cloud. And there might be some things that need upgrades. So for instance, you might have an old Windows server, 2008, and it doesn't, there's no analogy into the cloud for that. And you might have to take some mitigation steps before you do the migration to make sure you've got everything that you need to migrate into the cloud. Data box suite of products. So it might very well be impractical to upload some data to the cloud depending on the quantity of data. So for instance, from my desktop here in Lisbon, I did an internet speed test, and you can see that I can upload at about 65 megabits per second. That might be great for some areas of the world. That might be terrible for some areas of the world. But if I was to try to upload 10 terabytes of data, it will take about 11 days uninterrupted. And that's just not an acceptable speed when it comes to migrating to the cloud. You might have to do that well in advance and then do some type of delta to see any kind of data that's been added or changed. But that's not an ideal timeline in terms of uploading. So Azure has these data box products that you can choose from. There's the data box, there's the data box disk, and there's data box heavy. And you can see that there are quantities in terms of size that a data box can contain 100 terabytes. A data disk can contain 8 terabytes, and a data box heavy, which is more like a small piece of furniture, can contain a petabyte. How does that work? Well, Microsoft will actually mail this to you, and you fill it up with your data, and you mail it back to them. So there's a whole method of getting this around. Okay, so you get the data from your environment into a data box, and then you can ship it by courier to Azure, and then Azure uploads that into your account on the data center. You do this all by, quick courier type of thing. Now, physically shipping your data to Azure, and then it'll show up as being part of your account. And that can happen over a few days as opposed to a couple of weeks. And of course, you don't want your data just being floating around. So the data is encrypted. As you upload it, it's encrypted, and so it travels encrypted. And once they've transferred it into your account, then the data box is cleaned thoroughly and then available for use for the next customer. So besides computing, networking, and storage services, Microsoft also provides some other really helpful tools for your companies when you move to the cloud. In this section, we're going to talk about identity, access, and security. Now, these are fundamental security concepts in terms of being able to prove who you are and who you say you are when you log into an application, determining what rights and privileges you have to that, to which resources you have access, and even other types of security, network level security, all the things that stop malicious users from gaining access to your critical infrastructure. So on the exam objectives, we can see describe Azure identity, access, and security. And we're going to talk about a number of concepts and a number of Azure services. So we're going to talk in this video about Microsoft Entra and some of those Entra services. We'll talk about single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, conditional access, going into role-based access control and zero trust and defense in depth, and even the Microsoft Defender antivirus. So basically, we'll talk about all these concepts in this video and in the videos that follow. So I want to start off just in a general way of talking about this concept of identity. And on screen, we can see what would be normally is your employee pass. This one's blank, but imagine you've got your picture there, your name, the company that you work for, and this is what gets you access to certain resources, certain floors inside your building. It might even turn the printer on for you when you go to print jobs, etc. So in computing, the concept of identity is literally the representation of either a person, which could be you as an employee, or even an application that's running, or even a device. And so all of these things, a person, an application, a device, can have an identity inside the server that gives them access to things and denies them access to other things. So let's look at some examples of what an identity could be. Now, your full name could be your identity. You know, John Henry Doe, that's your identity. We also tend to use your email address as a proxy for identity because no one should have access to your email besides yourself. And so we often see people log into certain applications using an email address as the username. Now, when it comes to non-human identities, we can talk about applications. So your company's time entry application probably has a system identity that gives it access to certain resources, databases, etc. And the system then has to prove that the application is indeed who it says it is. And like I said, I've even seen other resources like a printer having an identity. And so the 6th floor printer has a 12-character string of text that identifies it on the network. And again, it has to authenticate what it is, and then you can actually connect to it and send jobs to it. Now, when it comes to authentication, usually we're talking about a password. So you've got your identity, which could be your email address, and you'll see oftentimes you're going to have to provide a password that is going to prove who you are, that you say you are. Now, in modern times, we often see alternative ways of verifying your identity, and so it could be some type of a text message that you get and you have to enter that number. It could be a certificate that you have, a digitally signed certificate on your computer, like your VPN might require that, and it would not use a password, it would use the certificate, etc. An application might use a certificate so that it proves its identity. Now, most applications might not even require you to log in. So if you're going to a website like Microsoft.com, there's a whole bunch of things you can do without logging in. It does not require you to provide your authentication in order to get in. But you will see parts of Microsoft website, particularly around the certification, Microsoft Learn, that do require you to log in order to get access to unique functionality that you have access to. Now, how does a website typically, traditionally handle that? Well, back in the day, I'm going to put on my old man hat right now, and I'm going to say, back in the day, you used to have your client application or your web browser or your mobile application, the user would have to provide an ID and password, and that would be sent to some server that would then go look up the ID and password in a database and then to validate that that is correct. Now, if you want to do it securely and not in plain text, you would have the client use a one-way hash on the password, and you would store the hashes in the database, and you can do a text comparison of the hashed values. That's called, rolling your own code, to use that, what we used to say in the old days, and is generally considered to be a bad idea. So you do not want to be responsible for some custom authentication encryption system that you've created yourself. If you think back to some of the most famous hacks that we are aware of, a lot of those have happened on some type of custom code. And typically what people have done in the past, hopefully nobody does this now, but you used to hear about passwords being stored in plain text. So some database backup got leaked, some text file got leaked, and it contains user IDs and passwords of all the users in plain text. Obviously, a terrible practice. Even worse or just as bad would be using some type of outdated, easily broken encryption like MD5, right? MD5 was one of the most famous algorithms in the world, but hackers quickly documented all of the possible hashes called rainbow tables. And now you can look at an MD5 hash and take that back to the original text pretty easily. So what people started introducing is this concept of assault. Assault, S-A-L-T, is a string that you add to the password. So the user enters their password, and then you add assault to it, and then that's what you encrypt. So it actually makes it more complicated and more difficult for people to reverse it. And you would then have, maybe if you want to be really fancy, have a different salt for every user. Well, if you store the salt alongside the encrypted value, then you're basically making it easy to reverse encrypt. So that's not great either. There's also the concept of having too short passwords. There still is a system, one particular system that I use, that uses 4 numerical digits as its password. And I can't not believe in 2024 that there's a website, no matter how important it is, that you're having a 4 numerical digit password. That's just not acceptable. So proper password complexity, of course, or now password change policies. This is a bit controversial. In recent years, people have thought that if you have a really good password, you should never need to change it. So let's say you have a 20-character mix of upper, lower numerics and symbols that is not easily guessable, never been used anywhere else on the internet. It's completely unique to this one instance. Do you really need to change that password? Maybe having a password change policy is a vulnerability. That's what some people say. But obviously having a weak password and then allowing people to reuse passwords all over the place, 1, 2, 3, 4 password, things like that. This is obviously a weakness as well. Now, we know Microsoft is a worldwide leader in enterprise identity management. So there's a piece of software called Windows Active Directory, and that is used in corporations for people to log into their desktop computers using ID and password that's centrally managed using Active Directory. Now, there is the web version, the online version called Microsoft Entra and Microsoft Entra ID. Now, Entra ID used to be called Azure Active Directory, but Microsoft went through a branding change a couple of years ago, and this has been slowly rolling out. So now you're going to hear it called Entra all over the place. Now, if you look at the Windows Active Directory and Microsoft Entra, there's a lot of similarities, but they're not direct replacements of each other. Obviously, Active Directory is designed to run on a server, and it controls a lot of different types of objects. Microsoft Entra has a real cloud focus, still handles identity, but it's not a replacement. For instance, the on-premises Active Directory uses protocols that would never work over the internet, like LDAP and Kerberos for the communication lookup of credentials. In terms of the online web-based Entra ID, you're going to use protocols that do work over the open internet, called like SAML and OAuth and things like that. So instead of coding your own security backend, this is recognized as a bad practice, you can actually just integrate Entra into your custom developed applications using APIs, and Entra will handle the authentication and authorization for your users. And it's used by millions of customers who themselves have hundreds and thousands of users. So if you look at the new model, you've got a identity provider. In this case, it's Entra. And you've got your client app or your browser that redirects the user to the identity provider. They can log in directly with the identity provider. The identity provider provides a token back to say, yes, this has been successfully authenticated. And the token can be sent to the server in place of authentication. And now the server can verify the token is valid because it's signed by the identity provider. I know that's complicated, but just know that Entra ID exists to take a lot of burden off of developers from having to custom design a backend for user IDs and passwords and authentication, authorization. And now they've got this middleman approach where the client goes directly to the identity provider and then the server trusts it. We learned a little bit about what Microsoft Entra ID is, and so let's talk a little bit more about the benefits of using Microsoft's identity as a service with your third-party applications and your custom applications. Now, the primary benefit for any identity service is obviously going to be security. So there's no point moving to Entra to handle your user IDs and passwords if it's not a more secure solution than something that you can create yourself. Now, as I said before, Microsoft is the world leader when it comes to identity solutions with their on-premises Active Directory solution. And they've had Azure Active Directory available on Azure for many, many years now. They've just rebranded it as Entra ID. So right now, millions of customers rely on Entra ID to handle their authentication needs. And that is hundreds of millions of users that may or may not know that they're using Microsoft Azure to authenticate. Now, you can use your own corporate ID and password with Entra, or you could have users create their own unique user IDs and passwords in the cloud. Even with Entra, you can use social media logins. So you could use your Facebook or Google or Microsoft account to log into an application that is the B2C solution. So it gives you many different options, securely handling the authentication needs of your applications. And like I said, it can be either your custom applications or selected third parties that have this built-in support. Second benefit is this is going to cut down on the amount of time it takes to develop and roll out your own application, and it's going to make support easier. The reason is, of course, Microsoft does provide their own support for Entra, and so you're not going to expect any kind of crashes or problems with that, and if so, then Microsoft will take care of that. It is just a few lines of code. You register your application with Entra as an application registration. You get signed a unique application ID and a key, and then you can use that in your code to pass off the login to this third party, in this case, Entra. So you don't even write the screens where you have to enter a user ID and password. That gets shuffled off to an Entra login. So this is going to make things easier. Now, Microsoft does have it's called self-service support. So if they forgot their password or lost their password, they can reset their password. If you enable that, that can also be disabled. There's multi-factor authentication and various options to increase the security. So this is all provided. In addition to the basic user ID and password, there are additional features available, and there's some really fascinating ones. For instance, with the right premium level of plan, Microsoft will use AI to look at login patterns and see if they match existing threats. And so you're basically going to recognize that somebody from a country in which you have no business, where there should never be any legitimate users of your application, is trying to repeatedly log in and repeatedly fail, and that's going to kick in and say, well, that's a pattern that we're just going to block those attempts. And so there's that type of feature. There's conditional access, where you have rules that are maybe less strict if people are using the work laptop inside the corporate network or versus using their own personal PC outside the network. You can have different login requirements for that, etc. There's audit features. Every year, people can be asked if they still need access to things, and they can self-select that they do no longer need access to resources, and that will improve your security, etc. There's tons of features built into Entra to help your application be secure. As an administrator, Entra is going to make your life easier in terms of having central support for all of your users and their permissions, being able to see who has access to what and make those changes. You can even flag certain users that must use multi-factor authentication, for instance. Now, one thing you might not know is that Entra does tie in with the on-premises Active Directory. There is a synchronization that you can enable so that all of your hundreds or thousands of users that exist on premises will have their existing credentials recognized in the cloud. What that means is you can have a user, an employee who has a user ID and password for their Windows workstation at work, and they'll use that same set of credentials to log into the company's app that is located within Azure. They don't have to have two sets of credentials. If every once in a while you force them to change their password, the password will change in the other location too, so it keeps it synchronized. For security reasons, if you ever need to revoke somebody's permissions, let's say they no longer work for your company, and so you're going to say, okay, I no longer need this particular login, then that'll be synchronized and those credentials will be revoked in the cloud as well. And finally, Entra does work with a lot of other Azure services. So for instance, if you want to extend your permissions into cloud services such as storage, then you can use their Entra IDs to assign permissions to storage accounts, etc. And so having Entra ID login as an option for virtual machines and storage accounts and other resources is going to make your life easier as well. So let's talk about one of the fundamental concepts of identity management, and that is the difference between authentication and authorization. Now, there is a relationship between authentication and authorization. They are all part of identity management, but they are also different. So let's talk about that. So the concept of authentication is pretty straightforward. It is the concept of proving you are who you say you are. So when I ask you for your ID and you show me your driver's license or you show me your passport, you are authenticating that you are who you say you are. And we do that through your photo, through the name and the secure document. In application world, we do this through typically user ID and password. Now, there are many different advanced ways of proving identity, including multi-factor authentication, which includes contacting you on a secondary device to make sure you're in control of your phone or your email account. We also can do thumbprint identification or face recognition or PIN code. There's many different ways of doing authentication these days, but that's just basically authenticating who the individual or the application is. In authorization, we assume you are who you are. You've authenticated, but what permissions do you have? And so, do you have the permission to perform the task that you're trying to do? So we may have perfect understanding of who you are. You've authenticated, but can you go and delete this file? Can you go and read this data? Is that something that you as a user are authorized to do? Now, Microsoft Azure has a few different ways of doing authorization. We're going to talk about role-based authentication in a couple of videos from now, but that's going to be one of the primary ways. Now, I should say in general with applications, we are moving away from the world. Maybe 20 years ago, you would have had applications where every user had the same level of access, and you just trusted that certain users are just not going to click on certain buttons. So it's sort of everyone's an admin. Well, we kind of learned some lessons over the years with various hacks and credentials getting leaked, where someone's able to get access to an application and then be able to perform some malicious actions, deleting certain things, modify certain things. So in the modern world, the recommendation is, of course, to give people only the level of authorization that they're entitled to. So if your job role is running reports and you don't ever have to modify the data, then you should not have permissions to modify data. And that's sort of the thing that people are moving towards. So we have authentication and authorization. And in the next set of videos, we're going to talk about how we protect administrators and how we do things like conditional access, role-based access control, multi-factor authentication, etc. One of the optional services that you can enable on your Entra ID is called conditional access. Now, these are services that you're going to pay for. So Entra ID has a subscription model. There's a free tier. There's a premium 1 tier, a premium 2 tier. And so you're going to get access to conditional access. I believe it's the P1 and above tiers. Now, the concept here with conditional access is that not every attempt to log into your system is equally safe. And so what it does is it attempts to rank certain attributes of logging into your system as being normal and routine and exactly as expected across a spectrum to things that are highly suspicious and completely unexpected. And if you go towards that end of the spectrum, you should do additional steps to verify somebody attempting to log in if they are deemed highly risky. And you can set these rules, right? So you're going to go and decide how risky a login do we allow. Let me give you some examples. Starting from what can be considered to be one of the safest attempts to log in, it's someone who you know is geographically, physically located inside your normal office building, and they're logging into the application from their company given device as they do every single day. And so it's just another Tuesday, 9 a.m. They're logging into the app. They're inside the office. You can tell they're using a company device. You can tell. And so that is a completely safe and expected a transaction. And so that is, you just take their user ID and password. And if that matches, you let